the atomic bomb and war termination in the Pacific. Goes from the 1945 to the present, goes over the different opinions about the use of the bomb, how it's changed over time, the key figures involved in that evolution of the ideas about the bomb. Really useful for anyone who's teaching with it. And you really can understand the shifting ideas and attitudes about the bomb. So I'll throw this up again at the end if you haven't had a chance to write it down. But the bottom line is to go to the Army Heritage and Education Center website, Historical Services Division products, and you can get it. To begin to understand what the war in the Pacific was like, Pearl Harbor infuriated the American public. Polls right afterwards, between 10 and 13% of Americans basically favored the elimination of all Japanese, just to wipe them out as a race. Very strong feelings there. And when the initial battles in Guadalcanal in the summer of 1942 really turned World War II into a very brutal one. The Japanese actions with massacring American wounded and mutilating bodies and tricking Americans with fake surrenders, it really turned the war in the Pacific into war without quarter, very similar to the war in the Eastern Front between the Germans and the Russians. Americans were amazed and appalled by the Japanese propensity to fight to the death. They did not surrender. It was not acceptable to them. The Japanese nation never surrendered either, and no one really was quite sure how exactly we could get the Japanese to surrender, especially unconditionally. Remember, it was unconditional surrender, and no one knew what it was going to take to get that kind of result. They did know, however, that an invasion of Japanese home islands was going to be very, very, very bloody. And to understand the issues about war termination in the Pacific and the use of the atomic bomb, you've got to understand that the dominant question for American leaders was not to use the atomic bomb. The dominant question was, how do we avoid this bloody invasion? And that's really what they were focused on. Now, I want to talk about, to try to get a sense of what the mindset was like dealing with the Japanese. I want to talk about another project besides the Manhattan Project, Project X-Ray. The talking about Project X-Ray reveals a lot about attitudes towards the Japanese, as well as about the wide range of technological developments that were going on during the war. World War II really spawned a plethora of different developments and different projects. Some of them may be seen as a little bit strange. And Project X-Ray is one of those. Project X-Ray was the idea actually of a dentist from Western Pennsylvania named Lytle Adams. Adams had visited the caverns at Carlsbad, New Mexico shortly before the war started. And after Pearl Harbor, he got the idea that somehow if we could somehow get bats to deliver little bombs throughout Japan, that they not only would intimidate the Japanese people, but they could start massive fires throughout the paper Japanese houses there. Adams was not only a dentist from Western Pennsylvania, he also was a Democratic political operative who actually had met Eleanor Roosevelt and knew her. His initial request to the National Defense Research Committee was turned down. So, but he did. He wrote a letter to Eleanor Roosevelt, and he asked Mrs. Roosevelt if she could champion his cause. And so she actually worked with her husband. And as a result, her husband attached this particular note to Dr. Adams' proposal sent out to his staff. Random for Colonel William J. Donovan, U.S. Government Coordinator Information. This man is not a nut. It sounds like a perfectly wild idea, but it is worth looking into. You might reply for me to Dr. Adams' letter. So with this note from the president, It's not to have character verified by the president, though. Whether he was a nut or not might be questionable as we go through the rest of this presentation. He basically got permission to start looking into the project, and the first thing, he'd have to find the proper bat to deliver the weapon. So the decision was made that they're going to use Mexican free-tailed bats. You can see how small they are. They did some initial testing with bats in Washington, D.C., and they found they really couldn't carry any load at all, until eventually they got a biologist on the team, and the biologist told everybody they had been actually testing pregnant female bats. And not surprising, they couldn't carry a load. And eventually they got male bats, and they found out they could carry about 18 grams worth of payload. And so the next thing they had to do was start finding bats. So that is Dr. Adams and his crew. Some people he basically pulled out of biology programs at universities in the Southwest. And Dr. Adams and his people would wandered around Texas and New Mexico looking for Mexican free-tailed bat populations. Eventually they did find one. They found about as many as 100 million bats in caves in Bandera County in Texas. So they now had plenty of bats to develop the weapon system. They next had to get the weapon part. The individual on the right in this picture is Louis Fieser. He is the father of napalm. He developed the napalm weapon. He pushed his development in a number of different directions, responsible for most of the fire bombs be used later on in World War II. But what he developed in this case for the bats was a little 18-gram incendiary bomb, little 18-gram napalm bomb that the bats could then carry. He does look like the perfect mad scientist, I must say that. On the left is one of the people from Lytle Adams' crew. His name was Fletcher, and he's in a Marine uniform. And one of the things about this group was that they had no real set orders. And one time Adams asked them, so what ranks and service do you want to be in? And most of the guys wanted to be in the Army. So he typed up orders on his typewriter, appointing them at certain ranks in the Army, ranging from first sergeant down to private. Fletcher liked Marine uniforms better, so Fletcher wanted to be in the Marine Corps. So Dr. Adams typed up the orders for him to put him in the Marine Corps. Again, it was a pretty impromptu organization that Dr. Adams was running. Next issue, though, is, okay, so now you've got the weapon, now you've got the bats. How are you going to deliver the bats to the target zone? So the initial problem is, how do you get to control the bats? And then they did some testing, and they figured that what you had to do is get the bats to hibernate. So you basically had to freeze them. So you would put bats in a refrigerated unit, that would calm them down, put them into hibernation, and then you could load them somehow or put them in an aircraft to drop them with their little bomb. The initial tests didn't work out real well because the bats did not thaw out in time. When you dropped them out of the airplane, they just basically fell 1,000 feet and crashed into the ground. So you had to come up with some kind of delivery means that'll give them time to thaw out. So here you have Adams and some of his crew loading up the trays that would go into the delivery system for the bats. It was basically looked like this. The idea was you load them in these trays, the hibernated bats. You would get them over the target area. You would drop the bomb, and as the bomb was dropped by parachute, and it would pop open, and little bats would sit there and sun on their little tray. Eventually, they would thaw out, and then they would fly and set their little fires. This is an example of one of the bombs floating down in one of the tests they did out in California and Utah. They actually found in the initial tests that one load of bat bombs would set 11 times more fires than a normal load of incendiary bombs. So the potential was there for them to be pretty effective. Uh, they decided to do extensive testing at the Carlsbad Auxiliary Army Airfield in New Mexico to try to perfect the delivery system even more. They invited the commanding general from the Western Theater to come and visit. They, Hap Arnold, the commander of the Army Air Forces, sent a photographer. And they decided that in one of these sessions, Feeser was out there as well. And Feeser said, you know, we ought to get some pictures of some of this. And the photographers wanted to also. So they sewed some little bombs on some of the bats and brought them out of hibernation and laid them out on the tarmac next to the refrigeration van to get some pictures. And the film crew said it was too dark. It was a cloudy day in New Mexico. They needed more light. So the film crew brought out these Klieg lights, very bright Klieg lights. Now the Klieg lights are also very warm. And I'm sure most of you can kind of see where this is going. And all of a sudden the hibernating bats thawed out and started to wake up. And in the process, they burned down the airfield. It was the visiting general's car, then the officers' club, then the hangars started to catch fire, and eventually the whole airfield was burning. The airfield personnel were all outside the gates because this was a top secret project they weren't supposed to see, and Fletcher was guarding the gate, and when the fire people tried to get in, he said they couldn't get in, so they had to all sit there and watch the airfield burn down. It was kind of a high point and a low point for the project. Basically the Army Air Forces lost interest at that point, but then the Navy Department stepped in. The Navy Department took over, and the Navy Department that basically pushed it until the end of 1944. What happened though in the late 1944 was all the money that had been earmarked for the Project X-ray was funneled over towards the Manhattan Project. And so we'll never know if VATS could have won the war, but we do know that the impact that the Manhattan Project would have on the conclusion of the conflict. Let's move now to the development of the atomic bomb. Really, the initial impetus for developing the atomic bomb was in 1939. A number of scientists were getting very concerned about German they knew the Germans were working on a bomb themselves. They were concerned about how far they might be. They were concerned about how the Germans might use the bomb. A number of these scientists were Jewish and had been persecuted in their homeland. Albert Einstein wrote a letter to Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1939, warning about the German bomb and imploring him to do something to beat them to the punch, so to speak. The actual projects beginning to build the bomb started November 19. There were two approaches. There were two different kinds of atomic bombs in theory. One utilizing plutonium and the other one utilizing uranium. One of the unique things about the situation is that there was no other country in the world that could have done what the United States did, which is basically pursue both approaches. They had enough money, enough expertise to do both. The Center for the Plutonium Development was Hanford, Washington. The Center for Uranium Development was Oak Ridge, Tennessee. And most of the testing and most of the scientists and the actual construction of the bombs and testing was going to be done in Los Alamos and Alamogordo, New Mexico. The first actual test of an atomic bomb was July 16th, 1945, the famous Trinity test, which was a uranium bomb, was the Fat Man bomb. I'll talk about that in a second. But it was the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima was the little boy, the plutonium bomb, and that had never been tested before. So the Hiroshima bombing was actually also only the first actual test of the plutonium bomb. Now, the statement I have at the bottom of this slide, the decision to build the bomb was the decision to use it. you had a project of $2.5 billion. There was a lot of momentum that actually took to, you're not going to just waste $2.5 billion. There's also things I will talk about coming up about the pressures to end the war, pressures to avoid casualties. There never was any serious discussion. It was pretty much by that end of the war, anything we had we were going to use that was available to be used was going to get used. The discussions about the bomb were always about how to use the bomb. And I'll talk about that state of mind as we go through the rest of this talk. But in many ways, you can argue the decision to use the atomic bomb is really made in November 1941, when the commitment is made for the massive resources to build it. Now, as I mentioned, there's two different kinds of bombs. The bomb on the right was the bomb used on Hiroshima. That's the plutonium bomb called Little Boy. The plutonium, it's a gun system where a piece of plutonium, where basically pieces of plutonium are like in a long tube, and they get basically blown together through the gun tube by explosives, and that creates the critical mass for the explosion. On the left is the Fat Man. That's the uranium bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki. The uranium bomb is different. The uranium bomb is basically a mass of uranium that was surrounded by explosives. And when that was detonated, the explosives went off around this uranium, forced the uranium mass together, and created the critical mass for the atomic explosion. So the two very different systems, but they're both turned out to be very powerful bombs. Now, the aircraft that delivered the weapons was going to be the B-29 Superfortress. Here are B-29s flying past the Mount Fuji on their way to bomb Japanese cities. It was a revolutionary aircraft. Actually, more money was to develop the B-29 than was spent to develop the A-bomb. B-29 is even a more expensive program if you count all the B-29s that were built. It was revolutionary. It was a first pressurized aircraft, pressurized cabin inside. It was faster than most fighters. It could fly higher than most bombers, could carry more bombs than most bombers, could carry up to 10 tons of bombs. It was what was called the Very Heavy Bomber Program. It was a unique aircraft. It was going to be the war-winning aircraft. It has many problems, though, because it was rushed into combat too early, a year early, and a lot of the actual technological testing had to be done in combat. Biggest problem it had was the engines tended to catch on fire. And that was a risk that all the B-29 crews had, especially on takeoff. They also had problems with the plexiglass windows popping out from the pressurization and taking gunners with them. Those problems had to be fixed in combat, and in the end, actually, more B-29s were lost to accidents than there were to enemy action. But it was a risk that the senior leaders felt they had to take to get this weapon to combat to help try to end the war. Now, the B-29s were being, initially, they were actually launched out of India and China, what was called Operation Matterhorn. Those operations, though, the logistics were phenomenally tough. To get supplies into China, you had to fly over the Himalaya mountains, the famous flying over the hump. It took 9 gallons of fuel expended to deliver 1 gallon of fuel to the B-29 bases. Japanese ground forces took most of the bases to keep the B-29s from operating. So it just wasn't very effective. The main missions are going to be flown out of the Marianas Islands, out of Tinian and Guam. And that's where the most effective B-29 bases were. They actually had the best range over Japan as well. And that's where the Enola Gay would fly from, and also Boxcar on their missions to drop the atomic bombs. The main B-29 bases, the major operations against Japanese cities, were going to be out of the Marianas Islands. And the first B-29 operations from there started really in late 1944. Now, the individual that really made those operations effective was this guy, Curtis LeMay. LeMay was the premier Air Force problem solver. Initially had been in charge in China, but when Hap Arnold realized that that operation wasn't going to work, he gave all the B-29s to LeMay on Saipan, or in the Marianas Islands, on Tinian and Guam. LeMay initially tried to bomb with precision daylight bombing that had been done in Europe, but because of the weather conditions over Japan, that was not going to work. And for a number of reasons, he eventually ended up resorting to night incendiary raids on Japanese cities. The first such raid was conducted on the evening of 9 March 1945. The B-29s came in individually in a bomber stream, dropped their bombs on a very densely populated part of Tokyo. This is the way it looked in the paper the next day, which talked about the 15 square mile area of Tokyo that was burned out, talked about the key targets in that zone. The focus was very much on targets destroyed and not people killed. However, the estimated civilian casualties were about 100,000 dead. This was the deadliest air raid of World War II. Not Hiroshima, not Nagasaki. It was the bombing of Tokyo on the night of March 9th, 1945. This is what the raid looked like from the air as the fires raged throughout that 15 or 16 square mile of Tokyo. What Tokyo looked like afterwards. Almost exactly the same as the pictures you'll see of Hiroshima and Nagasaki afterwards. The destruction was very similar. It's just that this was from a raging firestorm that melted the tar in the streets and had waves of molten glass floating down those streets as well. People were getting boiled in canals when they tried to go into the water to be saved from the fires. It was a terrible, terrible night. And this is another casualty from that particular raid, a mother and her child that were incinerated by the fires. You'll see very similar pictures after Hiroshima and Nagasaki as well. So the key point I'm trying to make here is to get a sense of what was already being done to Japan before the atomic bombs were dropped. On May 30th, 1945, Curtis LeMay held a press conference on Guam and announced that he thought he had killed 1 million Japanese in the fire raids. And he said maybe 2 million. The main focus was on industrial targets destroyed, but those casualty figures were thrown out, and nobody really seemed to care. If you look at the rest of the paper, sometimes for teaching, I'll drag out the front page of the New York Times from the 30th of May because there's so many interesting stories there. You can see the right column, which talks about the desperate battle in Okinawa. It talks about the Japanese banzai attacks and suicide attacks against the troops in Okinawa. There's another article further down which talks about the fact that the Russians are drafting 15-year-olds to fight against the Germans. And then there's this interesting article you can see at the bottom of the page where an American Marine was being court-martialed for sinking a Japanese relief ship. So it's an interesting juxtaposition of messages that even though while these horrible things are going on in Okinawa and in Japan, there are still some moral standards being enforced about some actions in the war. In this case, an American submarine captain who sank a ship that was supposedly protected. But the key thing here is this is the first time there's any broad announcement of what's going on with the fire raids, this May 30th briefing. And again, it didn't really seem to affect everybody except the guy on the left in this picture, which is Henry Stimson. Stimson was Secretary of War, dealt mostly with supplying the war, very little with operations, and his airmen had not been telling them what had been going on in Japan, and he was stunned when he heard about the fire raid. The guy on the right there is Hap Arnold. This is on a tour in Africa in 1943. And anyway, Stimson called Arnold into his office and asked what was going on. He said, "This looks like we are doing worse atrocities than even the Germans have been doing." And Arnold explained to him the necessity for the fire raids. Stimson approved what was going on, understood why they had to do it, that one of the reasons he approved the use of the atomic bomb was to stop the fire raids. In Stimson's view, the fire raids were worse than the atomic bomb. Stimson would eventually write the first major explanation for the use of the bomb, emphasizing very much the idea that the bombs were used to avoid 500,000 expected casualties in the invasion of Japan. We'll talk about that in a little bit later as well. But Stimson is one of the key players in the use of the bomb and deployment of the bomb. Again, he was appalled by what was going on with the fire raids, but he did not stop them. What bothered him the most was the fact that nobody in America seemed to protest them. He was really disturbed that there was no wave of protests about that particular tactic and how many Japanese were being incinerated in their cities. And another individual event that was this guy. This is General Carl Spaatz, who eventually came to the Pacific after the end of the war in Europe to take over command of all air operations. He was Curtis LeMay's boss in the air operations in the Pacific Theater. And Spaatz wrote in his diary at the end of the war that he had never been in favor of the use of the atomic bomb or the incineration of so many Japanese in the fire raids. He wanted to pursue more precision bombing. He wanted to avoid things that drastic. He carried out his orders. He did what he was supposed to do, but it was not a course of action that he favored. But again, that did not stop the course of the war. When Spaatz came over and he tried to change the incendiary raids, he found out that the only kind of bombs in the bomb dumps were incendiary bombs. The only things that the B-29 crews have been trained to do was do the night incendiary attacks. There was pressure to keep the pressure on he basically had to keep the pressure on the Japanese to try to get surrender, and he couldn't change the tactics. So he continued the fire raids. The last fire raid actually goes into Japan after the Japanese surrender on the 15th of August. Couldn't be stopped, and the last raid hit right after the Japanese announced the acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration and their surrender. Now let's talk about the setup before dropping the bomb. Let's talk about the course of the war in the Pacific. Iwo Jima is in February and March 1945, the fight on that island that most of you are aware of, I'm sure. It's the first battle of the Pacific War. There are more American casualties than Japanese. 21,000 Japanese casualties, obviously most of them dead, but there are also 25,000 American casualties, first time. So that's an ominous portent of what is coming if there's an invasion of the Japanese islands, Japanese home islands. Okinawa is in April through June 1945, bloodiest battle in the Pacific up to that point. 50,000 American battle casualties, 26,000 more non-battle casualties for disease and accident and things like that. Massive kamikaze attacks that sank 34 ships, damaged 368 more, killed 5,000 sailors and wounded 5,000 more. So 10,000 of those 50,000 battle casualties are naval casualties. It was an onslaught, unprecedented onslaught at sea. The Japanese themselves lost 110,000 military dead. Of 110,000 troops on the island, only about 200 surrendered. All the rest fought to the death. And it could have been as many as 100,000 dead Okinawan civilians as well. Again, this was all a portent of what was coming if there was going to be an invasion of the Japanese home islands. These are images of what's in American newspapers and news magazines. This is a page from Newsweek, June 11th, 1945. It talks about the fact that the Japanese plans to basically fight, going to use suicide as a national weapon. Mentions the fact in there that the enemy has 4 million men under arms, can call up several million more. And it talks about, that the shift to suicide tactics. It really is a very ominous report on what's coming. this is for the next week, Newsweek the next week. At that point, the Japanese it basically decreed that the whole Japanese nation were going to be special attacked. They're all going to be kamikazes. Again, it talks about the emphasis throughout Japanese society of fighting to the death. And again, and at the same time, the article talks about the Japanese last stand on Okinawa and the final suicide attacks and what the Americans were finding there. Again, it sets up this very ominous prediction of what's going to come with an invasion of Japan. At the same time, these kind of articles are showing up. This is from July 1945 in Newsweek. It talks about the American war weariness, that they can't get people to sign up in war industries anymore, that it mentions the fact that when they're bringing ships into Navy yards looking for volunteers to repair them, they just can't get anybody to sign up. The Joint Chiefs of Staff were actually very much afraid that the American will was going to break before they could make the Japanese surrender. They're really concerned about we talk about the greatest generation and everything that went on during World War II, but by this time, by 1945, there were signs that people were just getting worn out in the war. And again, the Joint Chiefs of Staff in particular were very, very concerned that the American public would not be able to stick it out until the end to force the Japanese unconditional surrender. At the same time that the B-29 campaign is dropping leaflets like this over Japanese cities, and they basically say that they tell people that we're trying to destroy the tools of your military clique. Bombs have no eyes. Everybody should leave your cities. We're going to bomb all your cities. And basically, the effect of these leaflets is to make 8.5 million Japanese leave their cities and flee to the countryside and the mountains. Very effective psychological warfare campaign. Effective. It's really, you can almost call it terror bombing, even though the main focus of the bombing remained on destroying industries. This was a spinoff of that effort to basically terrorize Japanese people. Again, anything to end this war without an invasion. In the end, we also mined the B-29s also dropped mines into Japanese waters that sinks over 1 million tons of Japanese shipping, shuts down any kind of transport between different parts of the islands. They also they firebomb between the 20th and the 5th Air Forces. They firebomb 69 Japanese cities. This is typical, though, of one of those raids. This is from the intelligence reports coming out afterwards. This is from the city of Shizuoka. You can see the caption on the picture: Shizuoka, city of 206,200, was 60 seconds destroyed by one fire attack, which also got metal propeller plant. So they basically burned down 2/3 of this city to get one propeller plant. But that's what's going on with the air raids on Japanese cities. When LeMay was asked by Arnold what it was going to take to end the war and when the war would end, LeMay basically told Arnold that he'd have the war would end by 1 October 1945. And when Arnold asked him why, LeMay says, because then I will have run out of targets by then. The idea was by 1 October, they'd basically destroyed any useful target in Japan, and the Japanese would have to surrender. But that's just a sense of the momentum behind this air campaign and what's going on. In fact, this is after the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima. This is a message that was sent from the headquarters in Washington to spots out in the Pacific. And I'll read it. It is understood that the Secretary of War in his press conference tomorrow will release a map or photostat of Hiroshima showing the aiming point and general area of greatest damage, all based upon information received from you last night. It is believed here that the accuracy with which this bomb was placed may counter a thought that the center board, that's atomic bomb, project involved on indiscriminate bomb. We're saying at this point, an atomic bomb dropped on a city that lands within a couple hundred yards of the major aiming point, which was a bridge near the major army headquarters, that this particular weapon is now a precision weapon, even though it destroys the whole city, because the fact that it got the military target at the center of the zone, that makes it a precision weapon. So you can see how much the ideals of so-called precision bombing doctrine had slid by the end of the war. Now let's talk about the actual missions themselves. The 6 August mission by Enola Gay was pretty much textbook. Tibbets and his crew took off from Tinian, delivered the bomb. They had good camera coverage of the bomb. This was the little boy, the untested bomb. It had worked fine, caused massive damage, and the Enola Gay had returned unscathed, on schedule, to the acclaim of all the ground crews. Now, the 9 August mission by Boxcar was very different. It had a lot of problems. When they got ready to take off from the airfield, they found out that one of the fuel tanks would not work. The fuel transfer mechanism was not working. So that meant 600 gallons of fuel that would have to be carried as dead weight could not be used to extend its range. There's a couple different reports about why the bomb got armed early. One that it was done because of concerns about the weather. One that it happened accidentally. But the bottom line was the bomb was armed early, and as the plane flew by lightning storms and as static electricity built up, there were some fears on board that it might go off in flight. Kind of a tense moment for the crew. There were a lot of problems with the weather over Japan. The camera planes got fouled up on their schedule, and they didn't link up well with Boxcar. By the time they all got together, because you didn't want to drop the bomb without having all the observation equipment there. By the time everything got together, the clouds had closed over Kokura, which was the main target. And so they had to go to the alternate target, which was Nagasaki. So Nagasaki was not even the place they headed for initially. When they got to Nagasaki, it was also covered over with clouds, but just at the last minute, there was an opening in the cloud cover. They could see enough of the city to drop the bomb. Tragically for people in Nagasaki, it was right over the main Catholic neighborhood in Nagasaki. So a large chunk of the Catholic population of Japan would be wiped out in the raid. But again, this was the uranium bomb. It went off similar to the Trinity test. It was not as effective as Hiroshima because of where it was dropped and because of some mountains nearby and some other things, but it was still a very deadly raid. It had extended, though, the flight of Boxcar. Boxcar immediately turned to try to get home, couldn't access the fuel in the reserve fuel tank. Basically, he had to crash land in Okinawa as its fuel ran out. And it actually almost ran off the runway at the airfield at Okinawa as well. It was a near-run thing for their return. So it was a very different raid, very different conditions and problems on the raid than on the Enola Gay raid. But again, both bombs were dropped. Both bombs had massive impact on Japanese decision-making. We'll talk about that a little more in a minute. You get some details on what was coming with Operation Downfall, which is the actual invasion of Japan. There were going to be 2 phases of it. The first phase was Operation Olympic, which was designed to seize the lower third of Kyushu, the southernmost Japanese island, in November of 1945. It was involved about 700,000 invading troops. There is some question today whether that operation actually would have been carried out, because the Japanese kind of figured out from naval operations and how far our fighters could cover that we were probably going to land in Kyushu to set up a base for later operations. And they were starting to mass defenders there. And they basically, by the time the invasion went off in November, the invading force would have been outnumbered by defenders. Never a good condition. The main attack was going to be on the Kanto Plain in Honshu with Operation Coronet. That was supposed to happen in March 1946. That would have involved over 1 million Allied troops. They would have probably been faced by about over 1 million Japanese troops as well, and as many as 10,000 kamikaze aircraft. Again, it was very, very imposing and scary prospect to face attacking into that kind of force again, and again with their suicidal reputation. Would have been a massive use of American firepower, but again, thank goodness for everybody concerned on both sides, the invasion never occurred. Now, to understand Japanese surrender, you've got to understand that like most events in history, there's not one explanation, there's not one cause that leads to it. The Japanese surrender is really the result of a series of blows. If you take away any piece of this equation, they probably surrender, but they surrender later. And I'll talk about the impact of later surrender here in a minute. The inexorable advance across the Pacific, including the fall of the Marianas Islands and the start of the B-29 operations, brought the fall of the very aggressive Tojo government. And new ministers were put into place that were much more amenable to pursuing some sort of peace. The submarine campaign, which devastated all kinds of Japanese shipping, was really a shock to the Japanese Navy. The Soviet intervention in August of 1945 shocked the Army. The Soviets basically started to devastate the Kwantung Army in Manchuria. It was unexpected. They didn't expect the Russians to attack at that time, and then it was another blow against Japanese leaders. The firebombing and also the atomic bombs created a great fear, especially in the Japanese civilian leadership, about a civil collapse and a communist revolt. They were really afraid that you would see the same thing happen in Japan in 1945 that happened in Germany in 1918. The civil collapse and again, the rise of communism, the communist revolt. The second bomb especially is what finally prompted the emperor to intervene to break the deadlock and say he would accept the Allied Potsdam Declaration and surrender. And even with that, even with the intervention of the emperor and the decision to surrender, the army revolt had almost stopped the transmission of his announcement of the acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration into the war. But mostly junior officers in the army who felt that was disgraceful, wanted to stop it, almost destroyed the rescript. They actually seized the radio station to try to stop the broadcast as well. They actually had killed an army general. They had forged orders. It was a near-run thing that the announcement of the surrender even got out there. I recommend a movie to everyone. It's called The Emperor in August, which is a Japanese film about the process of surrender. Really gives a sense of what was going on. It's an interesting film. There really are no one is really portrayed as a villain. Even the army officers who are revolting to try to stop the surrender are seen as honorable in pursuing what they thought was the right course. But it really does show the divisions in Japan and how near run the whole process of surrender was. Now, from that, let me talk about some of the myths or misconceptions about the bomb that have been out there. These are explained in great detail in the reading, which I'll mention again at the end of this presentation. But they've really colored the debate over the bomb in the last 75 years. One of them is this idea that we didn't need to drop the bomb because we knew the Japanese were ready to surrender. Most of the explanations that we don't need to use the bomb start with that particular argument, that we really didn't need to use the bomb because we knew the Japanese were ready to surrender. A lot of that the argument is usually based on intelligence reports from the Japanese ambassador in Moscow, who was trying to get the Soviets to be peace negotiators with the Allies. What those people generally fail to recognize, though, is all those messages from Moscow when they got back to Tokyo were all rebuffed and refused. The leaders in Tokyo said, we don't need any negotiation to surrender. We're not going to surrender. There were the Allies knew that the Japanese were had massive losses. That they were their number of aircraft were down, their food supplies were down, but there was no sign ready to give up that they could see. So really didn't know the Japanese were ready to surrender. There's another argument that the bombs were dropped primarily to intimidate the Soviet Union. Not completely false. For some American leaders, that was an important reason to drop the bombs, but it was not the primary reason. It was a secondary reason. Secretary of State Burns, especially, as some people said, wore the atomic bomb on his hip when he tried to deal with the Soviets, and did see that as major leverage in negotiations with them. That was never a primary reason to drop the bomb. For some leaders, it was a secondary benefit, but it was not a primary reason. Some people argue that a demonstration should have been tried, and that would have ended the war. In fact, there was an interim committee that was appointed to look at the bomb by Secretary of War Stimson, and they had talked about the use of a demonstration. But they had generally concluded that they didn't know for sure the bombs were going to work, and they didn't know the Japanese would respond to it. The Japanese might have said, okay, so you had one bomb, big deal. They also thought the Japanese might have moved prisoners of war into the area, so that the bomb would kill them if we announced a demonstration. There are a number of concerns about it, but a big one was just the doubts about the reliability of the technology. We just weren't sure it was going to work. Again, the little boy that dropped on Hiroshima, that's the first time that type of bomb had even been tried. So the demonstration was discounted. There's another argument that if we just guaranteed the emperor, that would have produced surrender. Instead of announcing unconditional surrender, we would said, I tell you what, we'll guarantee that the emperor, if you will surrender. The concern there is once we started to offer concessions to the Japanese, they would have asked for more and more concessions and wouldn't have stopped. That was the concern there. That in the end, it was interesting that the Japanese tried to ask if verification about the idea of the emperor, and we didn't really answer them, and so everybody was kind of able to understand the way they wanted to, but there was not an explicit answer to their query about whether the emperor would be preserved. In fact, the Allied answer was something to the effect that the emperor was still going to be responsible to the orders of the supreme commander of Allied powers. But again, the bottom line is the way the Allies saw it, they did not change unconditional surrender. For the Japanese, it was enough to persuade the emperor to actually push the surrender and sanction it. A lot of it was diplomatic jargon. Some people argued that should have been done earlier, but again, the concern was that once an overt concession was offered, then the Japanese would have said, aha, unconditional surrender is no longer valid. We can ask for a lot more concessions. There's an argument that the second bomb on Nagasaki was not necessary, that the first one was all that was needed. Again, it took the second bomb to finally get the emperor to get involved in the process and break the deadlock at his council. There's a myth out there that the air crews regretted what they did. Part of this comes from, there's a 1954 movie called Above and Beyond that talked about the dropping of the bomb. And after the bomb is dropped, it has the scenes of kind of shocked looks in the air crews and kind of regretful remarks about the bomb. And Deke Parsons, who was actually a member of the Enola Gay crew, who was an advisor to the movie, went bonkers with the news direction of the movies and wrote them a letter and said, how could you portray that there was some kind of regret about this? We knew we understood that this was massive destruction, but we also understood that this was going to end the war. We were not regretful or we actually, we were glad that we could do what we could to help end the war. And the producer of the movie basically told them that, understand that, but in 1954, with the Korean War just ending and all that, they said we could not have a movie that portrayed Americans getting any satisfaction out of killing so many Asians, because they were afraid it would hurt us in the Cold War. So that's why the producers put that way. The air crews were, they were doing their job, and they were glad to help end the war. There was one individual who had been a crewman on one of the camera planes who got in trouble after the war, and later complained that he had gotten in trouble because he regretted dropping the bomb. So he did try to use that as an excuse for some of the problems he had, but there was just, again, the crews did their job, and they were glad to end the war, and there was no regret for what they did. The last point is this idea of the casualty debates. As I mentioned, Henry Stimson in his after the war, he writes, and he makes the argument in the article that the main criteria that really made them use the bomb was the fact that they expected 500,000 casualties from the invasion. And there have been all kinds of debates about, was it 500,000, was it 100,000? Some people say, no, they had estimates up as high as 1 million casualties. The bottom line is the number really doesn't matter. There was, everyone, the consensus now recognizes that there was no American president in 1945 who could have not used that bomb. If you had, how could they have held this weapon back? We'd actually done an invasion of Japan, even if it was 50,000 casualties. How could you tell the American public we had this weapon where we could have ended the war, and I decided not to use it? I mean, there's just no American leader that could do that in the situation at the time, in the mindset of the time, with the sense of the casualties that were coming with any invasion of Japan. So the number, again, 500,000, 100,000, 1 million, the number is not as relevant as just the fact that heavy casualties were expected. Now, this is one people have to understand. I did not really understand the impact of later surrender until I was giving a presentation in Tokyo about the firebombing of Japan. And at the end of the presentation, it was a Japanese audience. At the end of the presentation, the senior Japanese historian there stood up and said, in the end, we Japanese must thank you Americans for the firebombing and the atomic bombs. Not what I expected. And he continued and he said, if you had not done those actions, we eventually would have surrendered, but it would have been later in 1945, and the impact on the Japanese nation would have been catastrophic. Some of the things that would have happened. The Soviets were going to invade Hokkaido in September. We had actually given them the amphibious resources to invade Hokkaido. They had invaded Sakhalin Island. Hokkaido was next. The end result of that would have been if the Japanese surrendered after the Soviets were set up in Hokkaido, Japan would have ended up split up just like Germany. You would have had a North Japan that was communist, a South Japan that was run by the rest of the Allied powers, and eventually they would have the same problems that Germany had with trying to get put back together later. There was an operation in September called Zipper, where the British were going to invade Malaya to regain Malaya. The zone that was picked for the landing beaches basically turned out to be a mud pit. The Japanese had figured out where the landings was going to be, and they basically, the British still went through the invasion in September, even though the Japanese had surrendered. All the Japanese forces sat up watching the beaches with their machine guns and artillery, watching this invasion hit. They got so bogged down in the mud, it took them 2 days to get off the beaches. It would have been a mass slaughter. But again, that didn't happen because the surrender in August. If there was going to be invasion, we were going to use poison gas on the invasion beaches. There were going to be chemical attacks on the Japanese to destroy all the Japanese rice crops. The actual invasion plan for Kyushu envisioned dropping there were 3 invasion beaches in Kyushu, and the orders envisioned dropping 3 atomic bombs behind each beach. And the troops had been ordered they were told that they could then go through those zones 1 hour after detonation. Now, this emphasizes how little we really knew about the impact of these bombs, especially the radiation effects. We didn't understand the radiation effects of these bombs until after watching the results of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You can imagine the mass casualties, the long-term effects of having these hundreds of thousands of Allied troops marching through all these zones where atomic bombs had just been dropped 1 hour after the detonation. If another atomic bomb had showed up, General Spaatz aimed to drop it on Tokyo, which would have been another massive destruction, a lot more casualties. And perhaps the most telling was if the Japanese had surrendered in November, as this Japanese senior historian seemed to think, you would have tens of millions of Japanese dead from starvation that winter. One of the great accomplishments of MacArthur's occupation force was getting food into Japan to barely stop a famine that would have happened in the winter of 1945. And remember, that's when we start to establish our occupation in August. If we had to wait until later in the year, there's no way we could have staved off the mass famine and the millions of Japanese dead that would have resulted in starvation. Now, again, there have been a shift in opinions about the atomic bomb over time. The initial polls happened right after the bombs were dropped in August 1945. 85 approved the use of the A-bomb on Japanese cities. And in another poll, which just said, do you think the atomic bomb is a good development? 69% thought it was. 69% thought it was, 70% thought it was bad, and 14% had no opinion. So it was very much, very, very positive view of the bomb in 1945. Polls today, most Americans, by a small majority, still approved its use on Japanese cities, but the majority think it was not a good development. The majority think that it was bad to have developed the atomic bomb. The attitude shift really starts in the 1960s. And again, you can understand that by, for the World War II generation, the atomic bomb ended their war. For the Cold War generation, it really began their war. Now, some of the shifting images about the bomb since, again, that the 60s is the key watershed where it starts to change. 1950s movie Strategic Air Command, which talks about the force which is designed to deliver nuclear bombs to preserve our security, is very positively. You've got Jimmy Stewart, everybody's favorite actor, as the hero of the movie. There's a Curtis LeMay character who's portrayed very positively. And then if you get into the 60s, you get to Dr. Strangelove, which hopefully everyone has seen. If you haven't, it's an American classic, but it also shows the shifting attitudes about the bomb. The Curtis LeMay character there is George C. Scott, who is a paranoid Air Force commander who's trying to figure out ways to win a war with the bomb. You've got a crazed Jack D. Ripper, a crazed wing commander who sends his bombers off to attack the Soviets on his own. But they're all portrayed that anyone connected with the bomb is portrayed as very, very in a very poor light. The whole idea of the bomb realizes the mass destruction and the end of the world coming from the bomb. Very different, very big change in attitude between the 50s into the 60s. And again, a lot of that has even maintained through today. The big thing about the atomic bomb is you can't understand the development and the use of the bomb unless you understand the mindset and the context of the 1940s. We have our own value systems today, but we can't impose those on the people of 1940. We have to change our own values, but we've got to understand what's in the minds of the people that made these very hard decisions in 1945. You got to the biggest ethical mistake, ethical error that American and Allied leaders could have done in 1945 was to lose the war. So with that, I'll open up to any questions. Hopefully, Mike Perry can kind of crank in and we can, and I'll answer any that are out there. I appreciate your time and interest.
Con, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, right now we got 3 questions. The first came in from Dave Bennett, who thanks you for a very broad and informative presentation, but he says, how much was the media coverage and government public information campaign was a deliberate anti-Japanese propaganda?
If you look at John Dower's book, War Without Mercy, Dower talked about there's propaganda on both sides. I mean, the Japanese thought we were a bunch of mongrels. Our own media often portrayed the Japanese as monkeys. Didn't affect military attitudes, though. The military didn't see the Japanese as monkeys. The military saw the Japanese as very, very competent and tough foe. But there's mass propaganda going on both sides. It's interesting that there's a movie called The Purple Heart that is done in 1943 that depicts the execution of the Doolittle Raiders. And FDR actually he holds that movie up because he doesn't want it to inflame American public opinion too much. One of the things, though, that happens by 1945, you have revelations of the Bataan Death March, which come out. And that really, again, colors American opinion. And that's not propaganda. That's actual factual events that have happened in the Pacific with the Bataan Death March. But he's right that the public opinion was very strong against the Japanese. A lot of hatred there, more so than against the Germans. But I really can't find any evidence that plays out in the decisions to use the bomb or in the military decision making in the Pacific. Okay, over.
Jeff, second question came from Jeff McCarthy. He says, wasn't it also true that the Army was experiencing high levels of desertion among units that were being transferred from the European theater as they transited the U.S. en route to California for their departure into the Pacific?
I don't know if I don't know anything about the desertion rates. I know that morale was extremely low, that all those troops being transferred from Europe had basically said, we've won our war, why do we have to go fight another war? The 8th Air Force was being transferred from England. They were going to train them to fly B-29s to add to the B-29 campaign out of the Marianas. Low morale there as well. I don't have any figures on desertion rates, but morale was very, very, very low among those troops that were going to have to be transferred to fight another war. And and most of them, almost all of them, echoed Paul Fussell's, the title of Paul Fussell's famous book about his attitudes. He was a soldier headed over there as well. And the title of his book is "Thank God for the Atomic Bomb." Over.
This is from Kevin Wagner, Carlisle High School. With such high numbers of support for the dropping of the atomic bomb, why do you believe the same generation adamantly disapproved of the Enola Gay being displayed at the Smithsonian for the 50th anniversary in 1995 and stopped it from happening?
Yeah, that's another one of those interesting historiographical questions. I talk about some of that in the reading. The problem with the Enola Gay display was the narrative that went with it. The veterans, the World War II generation, felt the narrative that went with the display portrayed the Japanese as victims, did not adequately cover the Japanese actions that led up to the bombing of Hiroshima, seemed to be apologetic about the bombing. So they were not they were not against the display, they were against the narrative and the description in the display. You had a real argument over there. The argument was about the narrative of the dropping of the bomb, and it reflected a lot of the same debates that I've insinuated. You know, was the bomb really necessary? Did it really save lives? I mean, one of the big problems here with all of this is ethical calculus is always a messy business. And American leaders, the question is, how many American lives are worth a Japanese life? You know, it's worth killing 100,000 Japanese or 150,000 Japanese with these bombs to save 50,000 Americans. Again, for American leaders at the time, I don't think there was any question. You know, today there may be more moral and ethical quandaries about that. But the problem in 1995 was not with the Enola Gay itself, it was with the way that the display was covering the actual action, and the World War II generation did not feel that the narrative of the display vindicated and justified their actions enough. Over.
Con, this is a comment, not so much a question. As someone who visited a museum in Singapore, and they had numerous interviews of survivors of the Japanese occupation of Singapore, and the general reaction there was, thank God for the bomb, because it meant I survived the war. So that's just a different opinion from a different organization.
That was, that's also universal. You had the same reaction from the thousands of Allied POWs in prison camps who realized that they were going to starve to death or be killed. If the surrender had been later. I mean, generally, there aren't a whole lot of people against the use of the bomb in 1945. English, Japanese. Over.
This question came from Dave Cormish. He's asked, which mattered most for the surrender, Soviet invasion of Manchuria or the bombs?
There is one Japanese historian who argues very strongly that it was the Soviet invasion. The general consensus is that the bombs were more important, but the Soviet invasion was important too. You can't take away any of those ingredients, the firebombing, the atomic bombs, the submarine campaign, the threatened invasion, the Soviet incursion. You need all those things were needed to force the Japanese surrender. So the Soviet incursion is important. It is important, but again, on the relative weight of things, it was not as important as the firebombing and the atomic bombs. That the firebombing and the atomic bombs will really create the fear in the Japanese civilian leadership, especially about the civilian collapse and the communist revolt. That doesn't come out of the invasion of Manchuria. But again, all those actions are important. Over.
Con, when you and highlight again the reading that you proposed, but this also asks, what other readings besides the one you're going to highlight would be useful?
Okay, let me see if I can get back to that page in my. As I'm doing this, let me. Okay, there's the reading. Let me say the best book on all of this is a book by Richard Frank called Operation Downfall. Frank is trained as a lawyer, now an historian. It is the best coverage anywhere about all the factors that bring Japanese surrender. He talks about the bomb. He talks about the Soviet invasion. He really goes step by step the whole process. It is very well done. It is very objective. It is the seminal, real writing about the event. So Richard Frank, I think it's either Downfall or Operation Downfall, but Richard Frank's book is definitely the best one on the subject. Over.
This next one is from Sandy Grasser. He's asking, it was my understanding that that Truman brought together a group of to discuss ethics of dropping the bomb. Is this true or not true?
That is, there was, he's talking about the interim committee. The interim committee was brought together under Stimson's auspices to look at the bomb. From the records of that committee, there was a 10-minute conversation over lunch one day between a couple of people about the ethics of the bomb. but that was it. The rest of the discussion for the whole time the interim committee was together, the discussion was always about how to use the bomb. There was never any real serious discussion by anyone about whether to use the bomb. Again, it's a $2.5 billion project. You're facing this massive invasion. Nobody really questioned the necessity to use the bomb. It's interesting that the bomb was when the whole group was, when the bomb project was first envisioned, it was designed to beat the Germans. And most people involved in this project knew we're rushing this project because we want to get a bomb before the Germans do. When the Germans surrendered and the focus then turned to use the bomb against the Japanese, there was only one scientist in the whole project who resigned. The rest of them continued to drive right on to pursue and use the weapon in the other theater. I mean, there was just so much momentum behind this. And again, it's in 1945, and because remember, they don't understand the radiation effects of the bomb. There's actually an editorial in the Chicago Tribune at the end of the war which says there's no scale of values which makes an atomic bomb wrong and a high explosive bomb right. The idea was they're all the same. These bombs were all, the weapons were all seen as being this, that you really didn't understand the real differences between the atomic bomb and other weaponry in 1945. Over.
Con, that's it. Are there any final comments?
Well, I hope that everybody got value out of this. I hope they read, if you read this reading that I'm offering, it really gives you a sense of the evolution of thoughts about the bomb. It's interesting that right now we have almost returned to the exact consensus view in the 1940s, that the bomb was dropped to save lives, to avoid invasion, to end the war. And again, the fact that we have different attitudes about the bomb and a different set of moral values today in 2020, even with that, the consensus judgment right now is that there was no other possible course of action in August of 1945 except to drop those two bombs.
Somebody got snuck in late, Con. They wanted to know, how is the bomb portrayed in Japan?
Anybody's ever been there, the Hiroshima, the Peace Museum, I mean, it's, the Japanese are portrayed as victims. They see them, one of the things that the bomb does, it does let the Japanese, to some extent, ignore their own atrocities during the war and focus very much on the final destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There's still a lot of concerns in Asia because the Japanese have really not faced up with a lot of what they did in World War II. There's still a lot of enmity in the Japanese. They don't teach World War II in their schools. They're nowhere near as, the Germans have gone out of their stand what they did and apologize and make up for it. The Japanese have not done that. There are still some very conservative groups in Japan that are very defensive about their actions. It's still controversial there. It is, but the bombs themselves in Japan are portrayed as great atrocities, and again, it's enabled them to portray themselves as victims in the war and not the perpetrators that they were.
Last question. Get Pete LaFata. He says, was there a third bomb in production?
Oh yeah, there's another bomb coming, and it was again, Spots had planned to drop that on Tokyo. Don't know if he would have had permission for that or not. Again, they're figuring by the time of the invasion in November, they were hoping to have as many as maybe 15 bombs because they wanted to drop 9 on Kyushu behind the invasion beaches. So they were still working on bombs right up to the end of the war.
Okay. I think that's it, Con. Thank you very much. Great talk. For those who want to pass it on to their friends, we'll be posting this up on our YouTube site here in the next couple days, and I'll send out a notice when that occurs. But again, thank you for participating. Teachers, please reach out to Jeff Hawks to get your Act 48 credit if you participated in today's webinar. Again, thanks. Great talk, and see you at work someday.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you much.
Bye-bye all.